All right, so the Nixon administration, in light of the Cold War, uh, uh, Nixon, Ford, Carter, the next three presidents we're going to cover, uh, more is to be said about Nixon than the rest of the ones that will be in this section of a lecture. Um, Basically, because it was, same as usual, business as usual. The Nixon administration began in 1969 and it ended rather abruptly. We'll get into that a little bit. In 1974. The thing about Nixon, a little background with him as a Cold Warrior, quote unquote. He was on the House of Un-American Activities Committee, with McCarthyism back in the 50s. He was a congressman, and that's how he made a name for himself in Washington, as being on that committee and really, causing a ruckus, trying to find some communists. Uh, Nixon's major approach was détente. It was a relaxing of relations between the United States and the communist sphere. Uh, Nixon did a lot more for diplomacy than many people give him credit for. Uh, what's interesting is that you have the SALT One, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. It's signed under Nixon. They began to kind of dismantle their arms from each other. Uh, Remember the Nash equilibrium, where the only rational outcomes of the arms race is for either both nations to build up their military or to build down their military, to take down their military. And Nixon kind of negotiated what can be argued, the upper left-hand corner of that equilibrium, where we disarm ourselves to some extent, and the Russians disarm themselves to some extent. And Nixon, diplomatically, he's the first president to go to China. You have uh, this idea when it comes to the American presidency as the one who seems most unlikely to do something often seems to be the best candidate for something. Nixon, the staunch anti-communist, actually goes to China and enters a lot of diplomatic talk with China. And as a result, we have open political and economic doors. Nixon's ideas towards Vietnam was the Vietnamization of Vietnam. Let Vietnamese fight the Vietnam War. Just put more and more responsibility on them, and to gradually reduce our involvement. One can make the argument that this is very similar to what President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama have tried to do in Iraq. To draw a parallel, at least, is let the Iraqis fight for Iraq. Uh, During Nixon's campaign in 1968, he campaigned as the president who had a plan to withdraw from the war. And as we know, as pop culture has taught you from the you know the beginning of your consciousness, you have Nixon is Watergate. Now, Watergate is a hotel that housed the Democratic National Convention headquarters, and Nixon is kind of behind this plan to spy. I mean, there was no way he was going to lose the 72 election, but he felt so paranoid that he felt it necessary to spy on these folks. Well, wiretapping and a few obstruction of justices later, you have Nixon resigning shortly after the House submitted articles of impeachment, and Nixon is gone from the scene. But we can respect the man for what he had done diplomatically uh, with the communist sphere. You have Gerald Ford, former Speaker of the House, who ascends to the presidency because, well, Nixon's vice president wasn't exactly a Boy Scout either. Ford assumes the presidency in August 1974, and he's president until 1977, January. Uh, and he oversees the end of the Vietnam War for the United States. And you have this famous picture here down in the right hand corner of the screen, the evacuation of the embassy in Saigon. Uh, that was it. Once the embassy was evacuated and we were gone. Our involvement in Vietnam was over with. And the people who can argue and say that, well, Vietnam, we didn't actually lose that war. It's like, well, let's look at the facts here. We fought a war there, even though we never formally declared war. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gave Johnson essentially war powers, and we entered into open warfare with the communists in Vietnam. But so we have the end of Vietnam and the Ford administration. In the 1976 campaign, Mr. Ford said something that really kind of sunk his candidacy. Uh, in a debate with Jimmy Carter, you have a screenshot there on the left. There was no HD back then; it must have been miserable. He says, "There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration." And that seemed to fly in the face of a key premise of the Cold War dating back to Truman is, yeah, there is a domination of Eastern Europe. Yeah, there is a huge influence. I mean, read the Iron Curtain speech again. I mean, it's pretty obvious there is Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and that is the problem. That's what we've been posturing ourselves against, at that time for the last 30 years. And this really sinks his campaign. As you look at that election map down in the right-hand corner there, the red states went to Ford and the blue states went to Carter. Missouri at that time had 12 electoral votes. We were a little more popular back then. And there you have it. That's the end of the Ford role in the Cold War. So you have the advent of the Carter administration from 1977 to 1981. Now, this man truly endeavored to work towards a peaceful diplomatic relationship with the world, and he negotiated SALT II, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, Part 2. But the thing of it is, when he came to the signing ceremony, he ended up not in a weird way or anything, but he ended up kissing the Soviet premier, and the staunch Cold Warriors in the Senate and the Congress and the House of Representatives didn't really take to that very kindly, and his treaty was never ratified. What we can see in the Carter administration, 1979 was a terrible year for Mr. Carter's administration, much like 1949 was for Truman. Over here on the left, I have a little graphic. It says that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, violating a treaty of perpetual peace and friendship that they had signed with that nation 1 year earlier. Carter's response was boycotting the 1980 Summer Olympics and suspending wheat sales to the Soviet Union. So economic sanctions and world protest, I don't know how effective that might have been against the Russians. We actually end up kind of funding a little group there, one by the name of Osama bin Laden, to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. And it's a very complicated issue, and this decision here by Mr. Carter to kind of intervene somewhat in the Afghan war with the Russians, it's going to have some repercussions later in history. And then you have the Iranian hostage crisis, that when the Ayatollah Khomeini seized the government, the Americans in the embassy were kind of left there, and they were captured and they were hostages. As Iranian student militants in Tehran seized the embassy and held these hostages for 444 days. And what's interesting about this is a little background knowledge. There had been a huge push during the Carter administration and the Ford Nixon era to really crack down on the Central Intelligence Agency. And bowing to some pressure, Jimmy Carter cut the field agent operatives numbers of the CIA by 40%. And what you have here is you have a hostage crisis in Tehran, Iran, and Carter wants to send in the Marines to get these guys. Well, They organize this mission and they send them in, and it's a miserable failure. There isn't enough intelligence. I mean that as in espionage, spying to know what the positions of the military are going to be, and uh, it just doesn't go well. And ironically, Mr. Carter's well-intentioned um, program of kind of cutting down the CIA really came back to bite him. And this failed attempt to get these hostages really looks bad for him. And it's very probable that this sunk his uh, 1980 campaign. And as we'll see, things aren't looking very well. Things aren't looking very good in the Cold War. But what we can hope for, is things to get better, and hope and and they do. And we'll cover that next time.